foreign currency. You have to earn those reserves somehow. And this is a risk that can really be bad. In fact, the risk is not that the interest is going to run away, but the principal is going to be far too big for you to swallow. This was pretty easy to do after the crisis. A lot of developing and emerging markets started issuing euro bonds or dollar bonds. Euro bonds were popular. I think a couple of banks were very good at selling the idea, because yields in the developed countries were so low, and people were desperate to get a higher yield, and the emerging markets had never seen yields that low. So it was a terrible temptation. And some of them have gone back to the well several times since then. At least one country in my mind is now going back to borrow money just so they can pay off the first loans, because they can't even service those. You must, and there's a similar risk if you issue debt domestically in a foreign currency. You're also facing exchange rate risk. Credit risk. Financial institutions lend out money. And as we saw in the crisis in 2008, a lot of housing lenders didn't really care whether you had a job. They didn't care whether you had documents. They didn't care whether you had any income at all. They were just trying to move properties, move mortgages. And we paid for it dearly when the debts all came, when it became due. If I were you, I would read The Big Short as the best explanation of how badly things went there. We have a similar credit risk, but it's not because we have customers, it's because we have on-lending. We have contingent liabilities where we're guaranteeing things. We're signing on that the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance is guaranteeing these various projects, or the debt of a state-owned enterprise. Or we are lending on, and we have to make sure that when we do that, we are insuring ourselves adequately. If we're going to lend money on or issue contingent liabilities, how do we collect some insurance back from those entities? How do we make it painful for that entity to see it as a put on the Treasury? That is, a put is an option, as you know, where you have agreed to buy something from me, and I no longer want it. We have a predetermined price, and I make a profit, and you're stuck with the asset. We don't want to do that, because a put option is exercised when it's convenient for the debtor or for the owner, not for the person who issued the option. How do we analyze these asset liability mismatches if we're going to actually do this in our Treasury work? Look for funding gaps. When are taxes due? When are benefits and salary paid? There's a funding gap usually. I had the great problem of all my taxes in the United States came in around the 15th of the month. Almost all benefits were paid on the 1st of the month. So for the first 2 weeks of every month, I had to figure out how much I was borrowing on the short term, just to have enough to cover. Carry out your cash analysis out into the future. Look at the larger patterns of cash flow. They will help you. Model your cash flows and then subject them to sensitivity analysis. What are the impacts of those shocks? And when you do shocks, use your historic data. It used to be, oh, well, let's go with 10%, or let's go with 50%, nice round numbers, but may have no meaning whatsoever. 10% may be well within the normal bounds. That's not a test. That's not a stress test. There are tools available from the multinationals that help in assessing the shocks that your financial system would undergo. But you could start today with a good Excel model. What do we do? Here we are. There's my mismatch of revenue and expenditure. You have to deal with, it's probably, this is data that I can't remember where I pulled it from, but it's very obvious that you've got regular payments coming in on one schedule and regular outflows on another schedule. And I don't know, you're going to have to use credit or so in order to match these so that they work. Okay, we're down to the end. Debt management. It's one way that you help analyze, one way you use debt to fix those mismatches between your assets and your liabilities, your inflows and outflows, both in the short term and in the long term. In the long term, we're talking about coupon debt because we have a structural deficit. In the short term, we should be talking about short-term market debt because we're talking about temporary cash shortfalls. What are your guidelines for borrowing? Do you borrow opportunistically? Are there limits on how much debt can come from foreign sources? How much can come in foreign currencies? And what is your maturity profile? There's a common guideline that says we should extend the maturity structure of our portfolio, but do that with some intelligence. We need some space to get out there. Here, I will show you these two pictures. On the one has a nice, reasonable glide slope down, going forward in maturity. That leaves space for borrowing in 10 years when you're out there. You're going to need that space when you get out there. The other was opportunistic. Oh, gee, we had a euro bond, but we had to make it a big one, and it's 15 years out. So suddenly we've used up a large piece of our future maturities in the near term. Was that the wise thing to do? Think about the patterns of what you're creating. Look at your cash flow forecast. Yeah. You need a cash flow forecast because that's what will also help you understand what your cash balances are. It's essential for decision making. It identifies those periods when you're in a low cash position and periods of excess cash. When the forecast says you're heading to a shortfall, act to do something to get enough cash in. Don't just use arrears. Don't just use cash rationing. When there's a surplus, invest it, even if it's for only a few days. There's an advantage to that. And I insist, notice I said a few days. I insist, I'm unmovable on the position, that a valid cash forecast must have daily granularity. Monthly is too broad. Weekly is too broad and too much work. Much of your data is daily anyway. You know when debt services are going to be due. What day is the interest? What are the dates for every interest payment you have to make from now till the end of your portfolio? You should know it. You should probably also know how much it is. You're already working with daily data. When are salaries paid? On a particular day. You're working with daily data. Use it. Don't throw that kind of information away. This is how we could use the forecast. Notice I've got a cash forecast that I've made up, the trajectory of our balances in the bank, in our TSA, and I have two areas where I can recognize I'm going to need to borrow some short-term money. That's where I need to know this in advance. But I also have one area in the green square, the green rectangle, that says I'm going to have excess capital. Use it, invest it, put it in a bank and demand interest from it, but have them collateralize it first. Borrowing short and lending long is a major risk facing financial institutions. It's what's led to runs on banks. In the US, more than one banking crisis has been caused by short-term interest rates climbing while the assets held by the financial institutions were based on long-term lending rates established before the run-up in the short-term rates. Bankers are often left in a squeeze. It's happened 4 or 5 times during my professional career. On the flip side, governments, I think, treasuries, have more of a tendency to borrow long for short-term needs. In many countries, the central bank has taken the short-term market as its domain for liquidity purposes. This means that the Ministry of Finance is often left with only the longer end of the yield curve for its borrowing. As such a result, short-term cash shortages get covered by 10-year debt. It's silly. It's too cumbersome to be used for temporary needs, and given the slope of the yield curve, you're paying too high a rate. Use the cash flow when you find a temporary shortage in your cash flow forecast, use short-term credit, treasury bills, or similar instruments. These short-term securities can be more easily redeemed with the return of cash. Structural deficits you cover with coupon debt. They're expected to persist for a long time, and bonds of long maturity are a much better match. The cash balance forecast helps you differentiate. So, in summary, if I were to summarize my views in this talk, our work as treasurers in receiving, holding, and spending funds, and in borrowing in the name of our citizens, deserves a larger framework of how we manage these operations with greater efficiency, beyond simply getting good auction prices, to fitting our work into the real tasks of managing a government. Thank you. Tried to get as fast as I could.
Bueno, muchas gracias a Steve. La verdad que llegó hoy por la mañana, hubo algunos problemas con el vuelo y tiene que regresar mañana porque tiene otro compromiso, así que, bueno, la verdad que le agradecemos mucho el esfuerzo de haber estado y acompañando este evento de Fotegal. A continuación vamos a darle inicio a la presentación de Francisco Lucero. Francisco Lucero es tesorero de Colombia, es uno de los participantes asiduos y habituales del Fotegal. La verdad que Colombia siempre ha compartido sus muy buenas experiencias con el resto de las tesorerías, así que seguramente en esta oportunidad Francisco también compartirá algunos de los avances que ha tenido en Colombia. Por favor, Francisco.
Sí, buenas tardes a todos los colegas y a todos los participantes en este foro de tesorerías, y muchas gracias por la acogida a la tesorería de Brasil. Pues en esta oportunidad es un tema que se planteó en nuestra reunión de hace un año en Argentina, de cómo vemos nosotros la tesorería enmarcada en la administración de activos y pasivos